that he would have to speak to you this morning. We have pew Bibles. We're in the book of Romans, by the way. We just started our series. This is the second teaching sermon. We'll have it on the screen for you if you forgot it. It's helpful to have it in front of you because sometimes I reference something that you want to look up. But we'll have it for you on the screen either way. So we're in the book of Romans, chapter 1. So I'll give you a moment to turn there. So this is Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Listen to God's word, knowing that he has something to say to you this morning in it, as hard as that is to understand sometimes. It says this: Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by his resurrection from the dead. Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations, including you who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. To all those in Rome who are loved by God and called to be saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Just reading through this, I don't know what stuck out in your mind, but there's something that stuck out in my mind as I was reading it. And I had this unstoppable desire, itch, to know what it meant. It's like when you're eating peanut butter or almond butter, if you're allergic to peanuts. You're eating it, and now, as an aside, I eat crunchy peanut butter only. But if you were eating smooth peanut butter, creamy peanut butter, and you came to a bump, you immediately stop, and you need to figure out if it's a good bump or a bad bump. It happens when you're eating any kind of food, really. You come to something and you're like, should this be here? You're eating popcorn and there's a hard piece, and you're thinking of all the horrible things it could be. But if it's just a hard piece of popcorn or a chunk in the peanut butter, it's good. So you kind of got to figure out what it is, and so you do whatever you do to figure out what it is. That's how it is reading this passage. There was one thing in particular that stuck out to me. There was a bump that I had to kind of figure out. I had to stop because I have no idea what it meant. And the whole purpose of going through this book together is to figure out what this means, not just historically, but to figure out what this means for us today. For you now, why you need this. We talked last week about why we need Romans, why we need it spiritually, continually. So we need it, and so we need to figure out what this means. And so the verse or the phrase that jumped out to me in this passage that I had to figure out is in verse 5. Verse 5, so look with me. So Paul introduces himself. He talks about the gospel. In verses 2 through 4, he describes the gospel. And we'll actually look at verses 2 through 4. I'm like saving that, earmarking it for Christmas Day, because it's a good one about the Son who was promised. But verse 5 stuck out to me the most, and it says this. So right before verse 4 ends with, Jesus Christ our Lord, verse 5, through whom we have received grace and apostleship. Okay, why has he received grace and apostleship? To bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name. To bring about the obedience of faith. And as I read that, it was a chunk in my peanut butter. I had to figure out what in the world does the obedience of faith mean, because it's the whole reason. Well, first of all, it's a confusing phrase. Second of all, Paul states it here because it's part of the whole reason he's even here. Why is Paul preaching the gospel? To bring about the obedience of faith. Why is Paul writing this letter to a church of Christians? To bring about the obedience of faith. Why are we here this morning reading the letter to the Romans? To bring about the obedience of faith. Why are you here called to belong to Jesus Christ? To bring about the obedience of faith in your own life. What are you doing in your kids' lives? What ought we to be doing to bring about the obedience of faith? What in the world is the obedience of faith? That's why I had to know. What is the obedience of faith? So that's what we're going to look at this morning, because it's important for us to know even why we're here and what we're doing is this obedience of faith. Now, Paul, in this letter, opens up the letter with this phrase, the obedience of faith. He ends the letter with this phrase, the obedience of faith. Verse 26 of chapter 16. According to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, skip down, has been made known to all nations according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith. Paul wants to get this across to us in the book of Romans, the obedience of faith. Now, like any good, if you've ever studied the Bible, if you haven't, that's okay. If you've ever studied it, you might have come across this situation where it seems like there's two good options, and it's pretty evenly split. You read it, and half the people say it's saying one thing. They think it's saying one thing. Half the people say it's another thing, and it's not very helpful because you're asking yourself, well, which one is it? Half of the smart people are on one side, half the smart people are on the other. And so you're asking these people, what do you think? As you're reading their thoughts on it, what do you think? Oh, I think it's option A. Oh, what do you think? Oh, it's clearly option B. And they have good backup. And so I was stuck studying and pondering this week. So we're going to look at this together about what this means. So option one. The obedience of faith means obedience that belongs to faith. Obedience, or doing good things, that flows out of a heart that has faith. It's obedience that comes from faith. It's doing good things because of the faith that you have. So when it says Paul is preaching the gospel to bring about obedience to Jesus Christ that flows from faith, and that may even be confusing to you, but think of it like gas in a car. The car driving is our obedience. It's doing the good works that God has prepared beforehand for us. It's doing these good things, but the fuel in the tank is faith. It's belief. It's trust. It's dependence. It's submission to God. So, option one of this passage, preaching the gospel, Jesus Christ, to bring about the obedience of faith for his name among all the nations. So why are you here? Why are we reading Romans? Why did Paul write Romans? Why is Paul a preacher? To bring about the obedience to God in your life that flows from faith. Now, the argument for this is really all through Romans, because especially chapters 6 through 8, and in the end, chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, Paul gives a lot of different should-dos, good things to do. And so you have passages like in the end here, all of these commands of obedience that we are supposed to do now that we have the gospel. Now that we have faith, what do we do with ourselves? And so we have a case like this, or a verse like this. It says this. Oh, here we go. He's coming to visit them. He's passing along. I can't find it. Look at that. Preacher fail. Here we go. Well, really, it's all through, so it's hard to pick one. For such persons, so verse 19 of chapter 16, but your obedience, I found it. Your obedience is known to all, so that I rejoice over you. So their obedience to God in their daily lives is known to all. And so I want to write to you, but I want you to be wise as to what is good, so do good, and innocent as to what is evil. So do good, not evil. Why? What is one of the major reasons that Paul is writing this? Why did God even send Jesus Christ? It's because this world has gone off the rails in self-destructive, inward-bending evil, of which we still have plenty of in our own hearts, but to shift it to back how he created it, good, others-focused, loving, caring. So part of this that we see here, option one, is obedience that flows from faith. Have you ever read the book of James? In the book of James, in chapter 2, he gives us a further proof of this concept. Listen to this from James chapter 2, verse 14. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? What good is it if someone says, I have faith, or I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus, I follow Jesus? What good is it if someone says that but doesn't have any works, doesn't have any obedience to show for it? Can that kind of faith, can that faith save him? Can a faith where someone says, I believe in God, but he never obeys God, can that kind of faith save someone? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm and filled, without actually giving them the things they need, what good is that? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Show me your faith. Oh, so someone will say, you have faith and I have works. So you're a believer, I do good things. And he says this is his response. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. So that's, confusing argument here, but the final verse there, I'll show you my faith by my works. How do you know that I have true saving faith? Look at my works. When I see someone in need, I respond in others-centered love. That's how you know I have faith. If I say I have faith, but there's no obedience that flows from faith, that kind of faith, the say it but not do it kind of faith, is not true faith. It can't save. And so part of here, what we're being given the option of in Romans chapter 1 is this. The reason you're here this morning, the reason that one of the points that Jesus Christ has in saving you is to bring about your obedience that flows from faith. It's kind of a good question. If you grew up in the church, there was so much pressure on being saved. That's like, now what? I'm saved, but now what? One of the whats that is an answer to that question is to bring about the obedience of faith in your life. To learn to live out the life that Christ came to just not only model, but give you the ability to do. So do you see here the necessity of obedience? If you say you have faith, but there's no obedience that follows from it, can that kind of faith save you? No. Do you see the need for obedience here? Do you live like that? God sent his Son, Jesus Christ, and sent people to tell you about his Son, to bring about your obedience of faith so that you grow in that day after day. Ups and downs, lots of downs. It seems like only downs most of the time, but in reality, God is bringing about the obedience of faith. So that's option one. And as I was reading this, I was not convinced. Well, yeah, I was not convinced that was the full answer. So then I looked at option two. I said, okay, smart people, group two, what do you think it means? Option two is this. The obedience of faith means obedience to, well, let me say it this way. Obedience that is faith. Super confusing, hold with me. Obedience that consists in faith. The gospel itself is something to be not just heard, but obeyed. Have you ever heard of this before? Have you ever come across this idea? So let's read through this verse 5 again. Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we've received grace and apostleship. Why did they receive grace and apostleship? To bring about the obedience of faith. Now let's stick that phrase in instead of obedience of faith. We've received this apostleship to bring about the obedience which consists in faith, or obedience to the gospel. Now let me explain this here. And actually let me show this. The argument for this is in Romans chapter 10. So if you have a Bible, turn there. If you don't, it's totally okay. Romans chapter 10 will illustrate this concept. And this is why the other half of the very smart people think this is what it says. So Paul here in the beginning of chapter 10 is really heartbroken for his fellow ethnic Jews. He's a Jew. He believed, he received Jesus Christ. But for the most part, the rest of the Jews said, no way. God cannot be man, no way. And they rejected him. And he's torn up about it. He's torn up. Brothers, chapter 10, verse 1, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. So, he continues. Look in verse 14. Well, actually, look in verse 16. So he's talking about his brother Jews, his fellow Jews, but it says, they have not all obeyed the gospel. They have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So option one was, once you're a believer in Jesus Christ, God wants to bring about obedience to him in your life that flows from a heart of trust in him. Option two is this. The obedience of faith is this initial response to the gospel. the initial response to the gospel of faith. This is what obedience of faith is. And as I was reading this, I thought, this is what it means. Because it says here clearly that the gospel is something to be obeyed. Have you ever come across that concept that obedience is not just actions, but you can actually obey the truth? Truth is something to be obeyed. We don't think like that. That's weird to us, but it's actually pretty common once you think about it. Think about a stoplight. In a stoplight, if you look up and you see the color, it affects your behavior in a way that you're responsible for. All right, so if someone tells you the weather, hey, it's going to be sunny tomorrow. Thank you, Lord. It's going to be sunny tomorrow. You might dress differently. You might wear shorts or not bring an umbrella to work. You might choose to act on that, but it's not that piece of information that it's sunny. Take it or leave it. Stoplight, that information that you're getting, it's not really take it or leave it. If it's green, you have to go. If you don't go and you stall and you sit there, not stall, if you sit there and you don't go, you will be arrested or at least ticketed or fined or pulled over because you're obstructing traffic. If it's red, you have to obey. You have to stop. Or else there's consequences. It's something to be obeyed. That truth of what color the light is has to be obeyed. If it's yellow, punch it. Right? That information has to be obeyed. This is the kind of information that Paul is saying the gospel is. I grew up thinking that the gospel was like the weather. Tell people about it, take it or leave it, think about it, sit on it, no big deal. As I was studying this, I actually see that my thoughts were wrong about the gospel. The gospel is something to be obeyed with consequences for obeying and for not obeying. And that makes sense once you think about it and go, oh yeah, God is the Lord. He is the governor. He is the person in charge. His information is not neutral. His information, especially about what you are and what he's done, is a command. Believe this or else. Don't just do this or else. Obey the gospel. Have faith. Believe in this. This is true. This is real. I am God. You are not. You are sinful. I am not. My son came to be in the place of sinners. Believe in him as truth. This is my command to you. The gospel is a command. And that this is all throughout Scripture. Paul, again, in 2 Thessalonians, his letter, he writes this. Listen to this, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. We see this again. It's kind of fire and brimstone. You can deal with it. It's okay. When Jesus Christ is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, inflicting vengeance on those who do not know God and on those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus. Here we see obedience tied not to the continuing fruit of faith, but to the initial faith. And that is what I think and thought as I came to this. Option one, Paul's apostleship is to bring about the obedience of faith, to bring about the obedience that comes from faith. Or option two, Paul's apostleship is here to bring about the initial obedience to the gospel, the turning and the saving that we see in Romans chapter 10. How will they be saved if they have not heard? How will they obey the gospel if they've never heard of it? So that's what I was leaning on And then I read one last guy, and I said, of course, why didn't I think about it? I can have my cake and eat it too. He said both. And I said, short way out. Come on, guy. Pick something and stick with it. But once I read his explanation, it made sense. I think Paul here, and I have at least half the smart people with me, I think Paul here is emphasizing the initial obedience. Why is Paul preaching to the Gentiles? Among the nations is his phrase. To bring about that initial obedience to the gospel. That's why he's been given apostleship to go and preach and plant in places where the name of Christ has not been named. He's been given this special commission to go into uncharted, unchristian territory and bring about the obedience of faith. But yet, in everything that Paul writes in the book of Romans, it's not like he means, I only want to bring about the initial conversion, but I want no obedience to happen for the rest of their lives. He teaches both. And so what that commentator said that was helpful is, both are probably in view here, but one may have an emphasis. And half the smart people and I say that the emphasis is about that initial response to faith, but that doesn't invalidate the rest of it. Why is the gospel preached? To bring about the initial response, obedience to the gospel. And then with that response, to bring about a life of obedience and joy rooted in, fueled by faith. What's your purpose as a human being? To first respond to the news from the Lord that he has made a way for you and to obey. What's your purpose as a Christian? Unless you're dead, your purpose is to continue to grow in the obedience that's fueled by faith. What's the purpose of coming to church? To hear the gospel and respond, and to grow in faith and obedience. Look with me at verse 5. We'll end with this. Paul has received his grace and apostleship to bring about this obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations. I don't know about you, but when I hear obedience, the hair on the back of my neck kind of goes up. I don't like it. It feels too, I don't know. I grew up in the Catholic Church. It feels too Catholic. Obedience, it feels too rules-based. If you grew up in any church, okay, not Catholic, Baptist, whatever, and it was all about rules and obedience, and your parents were super strict about rules and obedience, you kind of have this turn-off to this idea that God is bringing about the obedience of faith. But right after it helps us see the true light that we should be seeing it in. For the sake of his name. For the sake of his name. Paul, in the very end of Romans, says it this way. To bring about the obedience of faith, to the only wise God be glory forevermore through Jesus Christ. Paul ends this discussion of obedience not by slapping your knuckles with a ruler. What talking about obedience leads him to is praise. And when you think about it, what you're obeying matters. You're obeying the gospel. So normally we think of it as a list of rules, but what you're obeying here is this command to believe and live in the truth of the fact that you are actually stuck in the middle of a raging river. Someone throws a rope to you and commands you to grab it. It's like, obedience, really? I hate obedience. I grew up hearing that. Obedience, isn't that moralism? Isn't that... When you see the rescuer throwing a rope to you and saying to you in no uncertain terms, grab it or else, when you realize that what God has said about you in the gospel is that you are drowning, of course I'm going to grab the rope. Of course I'm going to obey. Of course I'm going to respond in joy. Oh, thank you. And you grab the rope. This is why Paul can say the whole purpose of God's work on earth is to bring about the obedience of faith, of your faith, and then breaks out in praise. To the only wise God be glory forevermore. We're reading through here. We caught the chunk of peanut butter in the creamy, which I don't actually eat. I only eat chunky, and it's for that reason. It's so exciting to figure out what the chunks are. So as we're reading here through Romans chapter 1, and you read this phrase, obedience of faith, you know the options, you've studied it, and it ought to lead us to praise of what God has commanded you to obey first and forevermore. So, with that, let's pray and ask God for help being obedient by faith. God, you've told us what it is that you desire of us. God, you've told us what it is that you command of us. Now we know, God, would you help us to respond? God, would you take our knowledge from a head knowledge to a heart knowledge? God, would you not just teach us about the obedience of faith, but would you bring it about in us? Father, I pray now for those listening who've never understood or responded to your initial call of obedience. God, I pray that you would show them the glory, the joy, the goodness of obeying this gospel. And I pray that they would grab the rope. Father, for those who've grabbed the rope and are with you, I pray that you would strengthen and fuel their obedience by faith. Father, I pray that you would give them new strength to obey, new strength to believe. Father, thank you that you would send Paul, that you would send your word to us to bring about the obedience of our faith for the glory of your name. Be glorified in